Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your host for this series. So now I want to just sort of start out and introduce our wonderful guest, Elizabeth Fideler. Those of you who've been part of this series for a long time know that I interviewed Liz. I'll call her Liz because that's the name most people know her by. Interviewed Liz earlier when her first two books were out. She's a prolific writer and has some wonderful books on older people still at work. And actually, those were the titles of her initial books, Women Still at Work, and then another book, Men Still at Work. And her new book is called Aging, Work, and Retirement, and it's a really excellent book with a lot of stories and statistics and information. And as she pointed out today, she's not going to be giving how-to tips, but it's more trying to understand what's happening in terms of aging, work, and retirement. So Liz received her doctorate in administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard University. She's the founding member of the Sloan Research Network on Aging and Work at Boston College, and she has a background in classroom teaching, senior management, positions at not-for-profit organizations, and education research. And she successfully redirected her research, as I mentioned, in writing to address the extended work-life phenomena that we've been seeing in our country and really globally. As I mentioned, she's author of several books, and the most recent is Aging, Work, and Retirement. And I actually initially met Liz through the Life Planning Network, and so it's really nice to both know her in person and know her through her work. And so the topic today is called Aging, Work, and Retirement, the title of her book, A Trifecta of Challenges. And we're going to be talking about trends really associated with mature workers. So I want to welcome all of you here. And Liz, I'm just so delighted that you are with us. And maybe you can start by just talking about what you mean by the trifecta of challenges that we're all facing.
I'll be delighted. Thank you, Dory, for inviting me to share my work. And trifecta came to me as just the right word because it can mean 1, 2, 3 order, something that's in order, or as in a racehorse is finishing a race, or not. It can also mean a group or a set of challenges. And it seems to apply to aging, work, and retirement because they no longer occur in linear fashion the way we expected them to occur, and they no longer conform to a prescribed order. Well, starting with aging, of course, that's a constant and going on all the time, but work and retirement now can alternate and do alternate for a lot of people. And, of course, all three can present all kinds of challenges that we'll talk about today, singly or as a group. So that's why I use the word trifecta. I hope that works for people. And I thought I'd explain also why I began to research and write about older workers or about the extended work-life phenomenon, as you called it. You explained that I had these careers in teaching and doing education research and administrative positions in nonprofits and so on. So I've been making transitions. Well, 10 years ago, and I guess it's 11 years now, I detected demographic trends when I started to look into Bureau of Labor Statistics data. I was doing that because my last full-time job, which was an education research job, had ended. I was on soft money, and all of a sudden I was in my mid-60s and I was looking at retirement without having ever thought about retirement. So I was not only unprepared, but it just wasn't even in my vocabulary. And without going into great detail, I applied for a bunch of jobs, and I would get to be a finalist for. And then I noticed that the person hired would be half my age and probably was earning half my salary. and it probably didn't have even half of my experience. So I began to mull over what was going on with that, and saw that was, I was wondering if that was typical of older workers who were out of work. And so I started to look into these demographic trends in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and found, to my astonishment, that the fastest growing cohort within the labor market, within the workforce, was women 65 and older, followed by men in that age group. And as time went on, it became apparent that there was now a decrease in younger workers, and that these were worldwide trends. And that really got my attention. It propelled me into doing more research and writing Women Still at Work and Men Still at Work. This, of course, this ability to keep working, of course, depends on having good health, having stamina, having the energy. Those are all essential, as you all know. And I also found out that, you've probably heard a lot about the increase in longevity, although pandemic deaths have now lowered life expectancy by at least a year. The general trend has been for greater longevity, and in fact, AARP, in collaboration with OECD and the World Economic Forum, in 2020 put out a report saying that in about 30 more years, more than 4 in 10 individuals in the world's most advanced countries are likely to be older than 50. That's just mind-blowing.
Amazing. Yeah, right. That is totally mind-blowing. Right.
Then, and I won't go on with a tremendous amount of statistics, but I have to share a few. I found that the projected rate of labor force participation by the older workers is already outstripping that of younger workers. In just the next 3 years, apparently in the U.S., among U.S. workers, 41 million will be 55 or older. That's going to be about 1/4 of the whole U.S. labor force. And then in 5 years, U.S. workers ages 65 to 74 will be nearly 1/3 of the people in that age group. And also in 5 years, U.S. workers 75 and older will be almost 11% of people in that age group will be working. So this is something, these trends have been accelerating and grabbing attention, not just in the U.S., but worldwide.
Which will be good to talk about as we go along, too, because I already see from the question page that we have people from Canada, from Portugal, and one of the questions that already came in was how do attitudes differ, in different countries. So I just we'll keep that as something that hopefully you'll be able to talk about, too. So, I mean, it is staggering to think about the number of people in the workforce. And so, and I know you talk about focusing on functional age oftentimes versus chronicle age. Can you sort of talk a little about that and then maybe share some of your research methods? Because I think you've used similar methods in all of your books. And I think that, it's really fascinating to me at least, and I hope to our listeners, of sort of how you approached, sort of these new demographics and these trends that you became aware of.
Oh, I'll be happy to. Well, what I really wanted to know, my main question was why mature adults would be working past conventional retirement age. I wanted to know their reasons for staying on the job. So to get at that, I used both quantitative and qualitative research methods. I developed a national survey, and I also did in-depth interviewing based on, I pulled people who had responded to my surveys. I pulled people out whose stories seemed potentially terrific and most interesting, at least to me, and I did in-depth interviews with them, which produced the profiles. The profiles I really feel are a feature of my books. These profiles of older men and women who tell their stories, it puts a face to the statistics because nobody wants to just read a bunch of statistics or even listen to them. And I found that because of what's called snowball sampling, my surveys went from person to person, but they tended, and this is a caveat that I have to have to share with everyone. I can't generalize my findings across the population of all older workers because my surveys didn't get to everyone. They tended to go to highly educated and accomplished professionals. They did not get to people who were poorly educated in low-wage jobs or low-skilled jobs with high turnover. That's kind of the downside of snowball.
Can you explain snowball sampling? I'm not sure everybody on the call knows.
Snowball in that if you go out to make a snowman or a snow lady or whatever, you make a snowball and then it picks up more and more snow, right? And it gets bigger and bigger, and then you've got the beginning of your snowman. The snowball sampling means that if I sent a survey to you, Dory, and you filled it out, you might have passed it on to your sister if you have a sister, and she might have passed it on to her friend, and somebody else might have passed it on to somebody at work. So it snowballs. It travels around. In fact, that's why it not only went nationally, it went internationally. So the first one was the survey of older working women because at the time I was curious what women my age were doing. That was what led to the first book, Women Still at Work. And then, of course, older men said to me, well, what are we, the chopped liver? Aren't you going to do something with older men? So, of course, I had already thought about doing a similar book about older working men, and those were the first two, and they came from Roman and Littlefield. And then I was able to do the newest one because after 10 years and after the Great Recession ended, I really wanted to look at what was going on, whether there were any new developments, whether the context had changed, and so on. I'm not going to report to you what the results of the earlier surveys were, but from 2017, which is the most recent, that led to the book in just this past summer, 2020, the median age of the men was 73, and the median age of the women was 70, and their top occupations were business. This is for men and women, business and psychology or therapy of some kind, higher education in some capacity, medicine, dentistry, a lot of people in nonprofit organizations, social work. Those were the top occupations. Of course, there were journalists and there were clergy people and there were people working in government. There were other, but the majority of the people were in those occupations. And what became very clear to me, and which kind of goes against the typical assumption, is people assume that if they're still working, it must be that they're motivated by economic reasons or that they're just doing it for the money, or they have a marital or a family situation that's forcing them to keep working. But the older adults who responded to my surveys are not staying on the job primarily for the money. In fact, need the income, which was an option, came in as number 10 out of 21 reasons. So it wasn't anywhere near the top reason. And in the newspapers and the magazines and everywhere that we read about these trends today, I still see that assumption out there that anyone who's still working in their mature years must be doing it for the money. And my respondents made it very clear that their top reason was what I ended up calling job satisfaction. For some of them, it meant sense of purpose or a meaningful job, a meaningful endeavor, or they got fulfillment out of what they did. And I'm going to quote you, Dory, because I read that you said that purpose is not a trend nor a luxury today. Does that ring a bell? Anyway,
it could be.
I saw this, and I put that out there because
I believe that. So I'm not surprised if I said something like that. But I can picture other people saying that too. So yeah.
People were saying that what was really motivating them was what I collectively thought of as job satisfaction, even though they might have expressed it as a sense of purpose or some other way. In second place, among the top reasons was that they want to use their abilities, their skills, their training. A lot of these people have put in years of higher education and have gotten advanced degrees, and they want to continue to put them to good use. Number 3 was that they wanted to help others. They want to contribute. They want to make a difference. A lot of altruism. Number 4, they enjoy their colleagues, their coworkers, their students, their clients, or their patients, depending on what their discipline is. And number 5 comes through loud and clearly. They love their work. And a lot of the women in particular said to me, I'm at the peak of my career. Why would I stop? It took me so long to get here. And in fact, a number of the women started off in other careers that were the ones that were mostly available to women when people of my age and your age were just coming out of college. You could be a teacher. That's what I did. You could be a secretary, a social worker, maybe a nurse, and if you were working at all. And a lot of people started off in those wonderful professions, but always wanted to do something. They had a dream to be something else, and it took a lot of time, and it took getting another degree in many cases. But once they got there, once they achieved that goal, that dream, why would they stop? That's what they were telling me.
I mean, it makes so much sense to me when I think about, kind of the role of work and well-being being the connection, engagement, and purpose and meaning. So your work is really supporting that it's really the being in connection with other people and and having that self-esteem and feeling, and being able to contribute with the skills and purpose and gifts that they have, which just makes so much sense.
I'm going to share another national survey that's been going on for 20 years now. This is the Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies annual retirement survey. You probably have heard of Dory in your line of work. The 20th annual survey came out in May of 2020, and I'm sharing this because I had 168 respondents to my most recent survey, but Transamerica, having the resources to do this, had over 5,000 workers in their survey. Mm-hmm. So I want to share this one just to give a different perspective. The workers that they surveyed had to be age 18 or older, working full-time or part-time, and for a for-profit company. And Transamerica discovered that more than 50% of the surveyed workers expected to work past age 65 or do not plan to retire at all. Mm-hmm. That's something we're hearing not only from Transamerica but others. And more than 50% of the surveyed workers plan to work in retirement, and we'll have to unpack what that means in a little bit. So I share that because this is not just the result of my research, but I just wanted to back it up with a major research effort by Transamerica. And I also need to make an important distinction, because most of the people I surveyed and heard from are working by choice. And that puts them in a very different situation than people who are working by necessity. It's a truism now that the people who are well-educated, accomplished professionals have more choice in the matter than the person who, as I said earlier, who's in the low-wage, low-skilled job. People who are working to make ends meet, they have to work out of necessity. I can share also a recent article by Jill Lepore that was in the New Yorker just in January of this year, January 18th, New Yorker. Jill Lepore is a prolific writer, and I always enjoy what she has to say. She had an article called "What's Wrong with the Way We Work?" And she talked about the people who are not necessarily low-skilled, but they have these unpredictable hours, often They're called temp workers. We now use the term gig workers. Jill Lepore referred to it as a form of vassalage, that's really a throwback. And she was making the point that Americans are working more hours. This is not during the pandemic. We'll have to qualify it. Americans are working more hours than their counterparts in peer nations. And with the decline of unions, they have fewer protections and are often exploited, especially these gig workers or temp workers. So the men and women who responded to my surveys were less vulnerable than the people that Jill Lepore was writing about. And she also pointed out, this is kind of cynical, that managers have been touting purpose and meaning and loving your work since the 1970s. They'd like to think that their people feel a sense of purpose and get meaning and love their work, but they don't always make the workplace conditions are not always conducive to that. So that's part of, we could talk a little more about that later, but that's part of when we talk about what makes age-friendly workplace as opposed to an ageist workplace, that's part of the cynicism that underlies what I like to talk about later. When we talk, go ahead, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead. Yeah, I just ended up, my battery went out on my phone, even though it said it wasn't going to, so I just missed the last tiny little bit of what you said. But
okay, well, we'll pick it up. We can pick it up later. So according to Ken Dickbald's Age Wave, 20% of the elderly are the most vulnerable, the people who are struggling the most. And Upjohn Institute says 40 to 50% of Americans cannot afford to retire. And even if they have good health and stamina and energy that I mentioned earlier that are so essential, if they're in physically demanding jobs, that can really take a toll. So not everyone has the ideal conditions for continuing to work. And another reason that was mentioned by various people, and I've recently heard this in a biopic. Bill Gates did a biopic called Inside Bill's Brain. This was on Netflix. And in that biopic, we learn Bill Gates admits that his biggest fear is that his brain will turn to mush. And so we have to make sure that when we talk about having good health, we're also talking about cognitive health, not just the physical stamina, the physical health. Should we turn to the impact of the pandemic?
I was just going to ask that, but I do want to, there are a couple of questions that kind of relate to your research approach. So sure. Janet from Arizona said she's interested in how many questions you asked in your surveys and also how you developed the questions. Was there something specific you were looking for? She's interested as she wants to further explore the space where people are who want to retire, but something's holding them back, and also to explore how they feel that they're being treated in the workplace and if that impacts staying or not staying. I wonder if you could comment on that at all?
Well, having done an awful lot of education research as in my earlier career roles, I felt I had a lot of research skills that I could bring to bear on this new endeavor, which is, as I said, going back about 10 years. And I just did a tremendous amount of research before I even developed the surveys because I was just reading in the literature, and I could share some resources at the end of my talk for people to look in various directions. But I did a tremendous amount of reading and research in order to learn and pin down what would be the best questions, again, with my focus being the reasons why people were continuing to work. So I had some criteria. The people had to be working for pay. The survey respondents they could be full-time or part-time, but they had to be in the paid workforce. And I hasten to add that as a person who has put in a lot of volunteer hours myself, particularly in our local library, I have only the greatest respect for volunteer work, which is contributing so much to our society and our economy. But I felt that for this purpose of these surveys that I was focused on paid work, and the people had to be age 60 and older. And that was influenced by the data that I was finding in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data sets. So I hope that helps, that answers the question about how I developed the surveys. I wanted to know enough about the people, what they were doing, what their level of education was, what field they were in. I did ask what they did with their leisure time. I did ask if they were also doing volunteer work, and found that, in fact, a lot of the people who were working full-time, men and women, were also doing volunteer work, which was most impressive.
Well, and actually, in this book of yours, your newest book, you actually do focus a little bit on volunteer toward the end, because it's also very meaningful work. So, but I did that in your surveys you weren't focusing on that, right?
Right, and I had, let's see, was it 21? Yeah, I had 21 possible reasons for staying on the job, and as I mentioned, needing the income came in at number 10. But if people had other reasons, of course, you always have to put in open-ended questions, giving people a chance to write whatever they want. So I didn't want to restrict anybody to my 21 possible reasons. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that does answer it. And there is a question, just since you're talking about the statistics and all, too, of, let's see, let me just find this one here. Hold on a second. Well, it was a question of, given the number of, here it is, Ed from New Jersey says, with that many older employees, particularly in the state, what's your sense of, are there enough jobs for young people and families? Are you, do you have any sense of, as you've been doing your research on how that impacts on younger people?
Oh boy, that's a really big one. People are, you could answer that for an hour or more, I'm sure.
I know, it could be a whole topic, so, right.
It's a whole topic in itself. The jobs, the work that the people are doing, the people who are my survey respondents, tends to be work that you don't graduate from college and become the chief of surgery the next day. Right. You don't graduate from college and become the CEO of a big company. The younger people may want to advance quickly, but there needs to be a balance between the early career people and the more senior people, whether they're in higher education, whether they're in business, whatever field they're in. There's a great value in expertise and experience, and that can be shared with the early career people. It's not a zero-sum game. It's best to think of it as, the term today is intergenerational workspaces, workplaces. Right. Will work in intergenerational teams. So it's not that they're in competition for the same jobs, because people who are in their very mature years have knowledge, skills, expertise, and sometimes they don't have all the skills that the young people have, and vice versa. So that's the beauty of intergenerational teamwork. They can mentor one another.
Right. Yeah. No.
In the ideal situation.
In the ideal world, right? But also, as you're saying, that part and the stories you have of people too are those, that with that kind of experience, and often in organizations they have the institutional knowledge, and so it becomes, sort of people wanting to hold on to them so that there can be the transfer of experience and knowledge to younger people. The enlightened employer would realize that letting that institutional knowledge walk out the door is going to leave a big. So an enlightened employer would realize that accommodations he or she would be wise to make accommodations to hold on to these very experienced people if it means, and we can talk about some of the changes, if it means the person no longer working a full-time job, but going to part-time, but still being available to be part of the intergenerational team. That's what enlightened workers are discovering.
maybe there aren't enough of them. But I wanted to suggest also to answer that caller's question about whether the more mature workers are clogging up the pipeline. I think it's Gary Burtless, Burtless, who's done some research on that. And so the caller might Google Gary Burtless and look for some of the articles that he's written on that subject.
That's great. Well, let's go back now. I mean, there are more questions that I'll get to in a little bit, but you were just saying before I sort of brought in some of those questions of, your research was pre-pandemic. And so, what's your, maybe speak to that, and also your sense of, I guess, how the experience of the pandemic may or may not be shifting things.
I'll be glad to. As I mentioned a little while ago, from my personal experience, I discovered that I was, as an older worker, vulnerable to long-term unemployment once I was out of bed. That was more true of me as an older worker than it was true that it then was the case with younger employees. That was already, before the pandemic, that was already kind of a fact of life. And, of course, it all depends on what industry one is in, what occupation one has. The pandemic has, of course, meant that hospitality workers and restaurant workers and people in various businesses that had to shut down are really suffering, and healthcare workers are in great demand. So it's not the same across all industries and occupations. Another influence is that this is an influence of the pandemic, but it was already starting before the pandemic. More and more companies are automating their production or their work. Even the human resources work is being automated more and more, and there are pluses to that. Artificial intelligence can be very hard on older workers who apply for jobs and just get their resume gets tossed aside because of the dates. If they reveal the dates of when they were educated or when they last had a job, artificial intelligence might just toss out their resume. They would never get it. Nobody would even look at it. And with more and more automation, there's a need for training and retraining and what's called upskilling, but it's not always provided. So this is sort of the churn around the pandemic. There have been, as I don't have to tell our callers, that there have been layoffs, there have been people furloughed, and even if an older worker does land a job, he or she is unlikely to earn as much as before, and the trend now is that it's forcing people to retire earlier than they planned.
Right.
So just in January, the latest BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics report on the jobless rate was for January, this past January 2021, and it was ballyhooed as an improvement at 6.3%. But there really are still millions who are unemployed and demoralized and giving up looking for work altogether, especially women who have stepped back from careers because they need to be at home with kids or grandkids or elderly family members. It's taking a toll on women who will experience losses in terms of their own health, the family's well-being, a personal sense of well-being, that sense of purpose that we talked about earlier that's so important. And bottom line, it affects their finances not only now but long into the future. A woman who steps back from a career in who was of pre-retirement age in her 40s or 50s is going to it's going to take quite a toll on her finances and her Social Security earned benefits later on and so on. So even if a woman doesn't step back altogether from a career, there are a lot of people going to part-time. They cut back their work hours, then they have reduced pay and reduced benefits, and that snowballs, to use the metaphor we were talking about earlier. Ironically, we are experiencing this new phenomenon of working remotely, which was controversial. It used to be really hard to get an employer to agree to flexibility and working from home. But with people having younger kids schooling at home, this boundary permeability has become the new norm, and it's blurred the lines between work and family for a lot of people. Now, this doesn't apply to our most mature workers, but I wanted to mention it because it's a big development because of the pandemic, and I just find it remarkable that everything that used to be so controversial has now become acceptable. Getting a more flexible schedule and working remotely, for better or worse, is now called essential.
It's so interesting to think about the impact of this and, how it's going to change for younger and older people, mature workers and younger people being in the workforce. But I, some of what you're saying and many of the questions are really focusing on the impact of age discrimination, of ageism, and even your own story people have commented on of, how hard it was for you to, find, that they were hiring younger people. So can you speak to the issue about ageism, age discrimination, and some of what, just even your thoughts about it, but also, what you learned in your study of, and in your writings about how people have been dealing with it, because it's so pervasive, and both the external ageism and also internalized ageism that, people feel like they're too old. So I just want to throw that out.
It all comes down to stereotypes. So some of the things that we said about older workers earlier, about their expertise, their experience, their institutional memory, those are all words that we talked about. Their maturity. We could add emotional intelligence. These are all positive stereotypes about mature workers. They're reliable. They're dedicated. They're hard workers. They're not absent from the job very often. They enjoy having a mentoring role. They want to be giving back. These are all the positives that are associated with the term older workers. But there are just as many negatives, and some of them are just myths. There are assumptions made that older workers will lack the technological skills, or that they're unwilling to change, that they're unwilling to learn, or they're just biding their time before they walk out the door. They're not worth the investment in professional development, so they don't get the training that they are health risks, and that their salary is high, so they're costly. And another negative stereotype is that older workers are going to be authoritarian or bossy toward the younger workers. And all of those negative stereotypes can be held by an individual who internalizes what they think others are saying or thinking about them. That's self-stereotyping. But the stereotypes can be held by the organization, the HR managers, the corporate leaders, who often have what we call age bias. And that can be lead to age discrimination in hiring, before hiring, even recruiting, even in the language of a recruitment notice can be age biased. It can be in not only the hiring process, but whether or not, as we said, whether professional development, training and retraining is offered. And it can be there in terms of whether they have policies and programs that allow people to have flexibility in schedule or the hours or even the location of their work. And it can mean that the employer doesn't offer any programs that would help people make a transition toward retirement. All of those kinds of things can either go on the side of age bias or age friendliness. There is a federal law that probably a lot of the callers have heard of, the ADEA, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, started in 1967, and the protection that it offers starts at age 40. But I'm calling it the so-called these are so-called protective measures because it's been very difficult to prove age bias or age discrimination in the workplace. And recently, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania introduced a Senate bill called POWADA, which is Protecting Older Workers Against Discrimination Act. The POWADA would allow a worker who's trying to make an age discrimination claim, that worker would no longer have to prove that age bias was the sole deciding factor in an adverse employment decision. But that hasn't passed. That's just pending. It was co-sponsored by Senators Grassley, Leahy of Vermont, and Collins of Maine. So do we have additional questions about, or should we?
Yeah, well, people just sort of wanting you to talk about it because, and also with the impact of the pandemic, there have been a couple of questions about it's not just women, but men too that are, losing work and having trouble, getting rehired, and just that issue that you mentioned about, many people being forced to retire when they can't. So it's going to end up being, people perhaps being more influenced by the economic necessity of working and sort of what's going to happen with that. But a couple of questions came in wondering with the people who responded to your survey and those that you told stories about, what kind of, or have you discovered what kind of organizations or industries seem to be better for the more mature worker? And, did some of the people that you highlighted in the book talk about the age discrimination and how they dealt with it, or were they in industries where they were so valued for what they contributed that it wasn't so much of an issue?
That's probably what the last point you made is probably the main point. People who are at the peak of their careers, these well-educated, highly accomplished professionals, they're not going to be kicked around and exploited quite so easily as others. Right. So my respondents in general were not very many of them were complaining about age bias, because if you're self-employed, then you don't have that issue. People who are working in let's say higher education, and if they have tenure, they have some protections. These you can't generalize across all industries and all fields, but being productive and having the skills and the education and the expertise and the experience, all of that is not always enough to protect a person from workplace conditions where, for example, the working conditions might be a problem with your supervisor, or it might be that the pandemic is forcing the business to lay people off, or the business is simply closing altogether. Some of the separation from work could be really involuntary, forced by the employer's problems, but sometimes they're personal decisions, personal reasons, or family concerns, or health reasons that force earlier separation from work than was expected. When I think of the gender differences, we have to come back to the fact that women do 90% of the caregiving. This is according to Dr. Pat Armstrong, who gave a talk the other day that I was listening to. She's a York University sociologist, York University in Canada, in Ontario in Canada. And women then are especially vulnerable because if they're also working and caregiving, that can surely have a negative impact on their health and their well-being. So they're doing a lot of what was called the informal work, which means unpaid, child care and elder care, plus the household labor. And this puts them in a down position in terms of their future fiscal security. They're less apt to have any savings or decent savings in a retirement plan they're less apt to have much in Social Security the more they're out of the workforce or limited in the workforce. So there's a disparate impact on women, not just because of the pandemic, but in terms of career longevity in one's career.
It's so
Should we talk a little bit?
It's a hard area. Yeah, go ahead.
Talk a little bit about the changing views of retirement. I know you're going to have Helen Dennis talk on your show in April.
In April, right? Yep. But why don't you comment on some of the changing things too? Yep.
But I did get to explore the changing views of retirement in the new book, Aging, Work, and Retirement, because it comes up so often now, not just because of the pandemic. And retirement has always been what the majority of people age 60 or 65 are looking forward to doing. So what's changed? Well, retirement used to be a permanent exit. You retired cold turkey, and that was it, and you were then on the shelf. When 10 years ago, when I first thought of the book that I was going to write about women who were still on the job, I was originally going to call it Not Yet on the Shelf. Because
right.
But my editor didn't want me to use that title, so I changed it. But retirement today is more likely to be a transition, as we said earlier, from the career job, a phased process, often going from full-time to part-time with reduced responsibilities and then reduced pay. A new term that's come up is the bridge job with the new or reduced responsibilities that allows the worker to make a transition from the full traditional career job to a modification of it. And we have another new term called unretirement, where people, and some of the people in my books have made it very clear that they were totally bored or dissatisfied with retirement, and they unretired and went back to work in some other capacity. As I said earlier, when I used the word trifecta, work and retirement can alternate. People can be working, they can retire, they can come back to work, they can retire again, and sometimes they then go to self-employment. I have some fascinating statistics quickly to share with you about self-employment. That 13% of people who are self-employed in this country are in their 50s. 15% of the self-employed people are in the 60 to 64 age group, and 21% of the self-employed people are in the 65 to 69-year-old cohort. So that says that being one's own boss has great appeal, even though self-employment can be very risky, not just financially, but in every other way. So
but that really does support that notion that the over 50 population is the fastest growing population of entrepreneurs. And you're saying that even higher in the 65 to 69. So, I mean, it's true. You know, you reach a point where you want a little more control over your life, except being an entrepreneur sometimes means you're working more rather than less. So.
Yeah, it has, one can work as much or as little. That leaves time to do some of the other things that old, mature adults like to think that they're going to do in what's called, there's all this terminology, the second half, the third age, bonus years. People, though, who want, and these terms are, I guess, not all interchangeable, but they're getting at this extended period of, which we hope is an extended period of time when these people and certainly the people who responded to my surveys and people I wrote about and profiled in my, sometimes it's referred to as productive aging, sometimes it's referred to as positive aging, sometimes it's referred to as active aging. Those are all the positive terms, and I like to contrast them with what I call the dismal Ds. So much of what the GSA, the Gerontological Society of America, addresses, or the ASA, the American Society on Aging, so much of what they focus on are the people who are depressed, dependent, have dementia, have disabilities or just other diseases. And not all, luckily, not all, in fact, a greater and greater number of people are actively aging, positively aging. And that doesn't have to include work, but it can include work. And also, of course, it can include being useful, having an encore career, whether it's for pay or not, using one's time in very positive ways and feeling that one's making a useful contribution gives satisfaction, whether one is partially retired, unretired, or even fully retired. It turns out that the Urban Institute did a study in 2018. This was by Richard Johnson and Peter Goslin, and they reported on data that they took from the health and retirement study. They looked at adults ages 50 to 54 who were employed full-time for at least 5 years, and they tracked a sample of more than 2,000 people and discovered that retirement satisfaction has fallen steadily. It's declined for both men and women and for all educational and racial and ethnic groups. I won't go into all the details, but since that's an area that's your expertise, Dory, you can certainly comment on that. A lot of people get to retirement and it's unsatisfactory, and they decide that they'll go back to work, but maybe not in the same traditional career job that they had before.
Well, I think that's very true, and I think it's connected to really what you were talking about at the beginning, and some of the people that you profile in your book, that people may be, well, in some situations, people may be feeling burnt out from their jobs, but retirement really isn't a destination anymore, and we've got so many, more years, although it is concerning that the longevity kind of revolution is shortening a little with the pandemic, because there's already been a year lost in lifespan, life longevity right now. But I do think that, when people stop working, and maybe it's kind of that at the beginning it may feel fine, but there's so many different motivators that people have that I think you're talking about, and people get bored, or people realize, I have more I want to give. I want that connection, engagement, and purpose and meaning. And so, then it's, people are able to formulate it more as the transition, like, I don't want to necessarily work full time, but I want, as you were saying, either the part-time or phased, or, maybe using my skills in a different arena.
People
go ahead.
who are used to having structure in their lives miss that. Yeah. I mean, during this pandemic where people are staying indoors so much and doing Zoom calls, that works up to a point. But right. If they're used to having a stronger reason for getting up in the morning than just a Zoom call, there's a lot of job satisfaction that they miss.
One of the questions that I have, and then maybe I can incorporate a few more from people here too, is when you were doing the survey, was there a gender difference between some of the issues that men and women said about their reasons for choosing to work more, or were they pretty much similar?
They were, by the third time I did the survey, this was 10 years after the first one, they were remarkably close on some of those top reasons. For example, the top reason being satisfaction, finding meaning in work, they were almost identically. These are in rank order. Using their abilities, skills, and training, women were 85% said that, and 77% for the men. So, as I said earlier, I think the women, it was a little more of a struggle for a lot of these older women to get where they got in terms of their education and training. And frankly, they essentially said to me, "I'll be damned if I'll give this up. I've invested so much in in developing the skills and training I need." Helping others was very close. Loving their work, women were 79%, men were 59%. So the women came across with expressed a more powerful motivation for continuing to work. Then enjoying the colleagues and the coworkers, here it reversed. The men were at 70% and the women at 58%. Yes, there were some differences. The men seemed to enjoy mentoring younger workers more than the women. Men were at 53%, women 33%. When you have keeping busy, get out of the house as a reason for continuing to work, men and women were identical, 42%. Needing the income, 42%, identical. So I won't go through all of them, but I think
that's helpful. Yeah.
There were some differences. For me, if I could generalize, the biggest difference was the level of fiscal security that men enjoy, and that women, there was more fiscal insecurity in their older years as a result of their work history.
Maybe not having worked as long, or
not having worked as long, not having been paid as much. Remember, there still is a gender pay gap, even though it's closing. And so for the reasons that I think are probably familiar to a lot of people, in their later years, women are not as fiscally secure. Now we're generalizing, are not as fiscally secure as men.
Right. So a couple of questions I'm going to kind of incorporate. Dale from Arizona and Barbara from Maine. Are you aware of any programs, either local, state, national, that offer assistance to workers who've been thrown into the retirement prematurely? And also sort of incorporating, with many employers needing to reduce costs, particularly post-pandemic, have you seen any increasing number of employee retirement incentive programs? She says that in her career counseling company, there's been some requests, including career planning for the next act component. But I think both are interconnected about, are you aware of programs? And right now it's, kind of this country. And then I do want to ask a little bit about what's happening globally, because there have been some questions about that. But are you aware of, any programs in terms of the retraining, or, as you say, upskilling, retraining, training, any, programs that you're aware of?
There's one federal program for the eligibility for the program is there's an income eligibility requirement. It tends to be for low-income people. It's the CSEP program, and I'm always getting the letters mixed up. I think it's SCSEP, and so that's the main federal program that I know of that offers assistance to workers. Other than that, I can't speak to what's available in every state. I know Massachusetts is trying to position itself as the age-friendliest state. I don't know if we here in Massachusetts deserve that title, but there are programs in different states. There are community college programs. There's a growing awareness of the benefits of community college programs that will give people certificates. They don't necessarily take an associate's degree. They may be there for a license or a certificate to get the foundation, the training necessary to go to work for an industry or a company. Mm-hmm. That opens up a whole other conversation about lifelong learning and what's available to people. And then, of course, individual businesses and companies some are willing to do the training, but not enough.
Mm-hmm. Right. Clearly, we're going to need to have you come back again. But can you comment a little, because I know we've been talking more, and I think most of your study has been based on this country, but we have had a few people with more global questions of just wondering, are you aware, are these trends happening, kind of worldwide, globally? Are you aware of differences between our country and some of the other countries in terms of the mature worker?
Well, I can refer callers to a variety of sources, And one of the ways that I have been able to follow the worldwide trends is through the Work and Family Researchers Network, WFRN.org. Their main focus is work-life balance. And it turns out that the United States is farther behind almost every other country in the world when it comes to work-life balance, whether there are programs and policies in place at the national level, whatever the country is. Even developing countries that are way ahead of the United States, let alone the developed countries. The support, for example, is amazing in terms of parental leave and getting your job back and so on. I also would refer people to Pass It On Network, PION, for their wonderful resources because PION, Pass It On Network, led by Jan Hively and Moira Allen, they have liaison in countries all over the world who are looking at issues of aging. And these trends in greater health and greater longevity are true all around the world, and it's not just Japan that has a lot of older people. And how it affects the workforce is of great interest to me, and I hope some of the callers. The Center on Aging and Work at Boston College is always a great resource. I'm associated with the Boston College Center on Aging and Work, particularly through the Sloan Research Network on Aging and Work. And, of course, there's AARP and the World Economic Forum and the OECD countries. There's also the Urban Institute as a resource. But for worldwide issues and trends, I think that what's happening in this country is not vastly different from what's happening globally, but our country's response to what's happening in terms of the shortage of younger workers and the increase in older workers, our country's response to it is slower and certainly less generous than in other countries, if I had to generalize.
Yeah, that's very sobering, but I think you're accurate. You are so filled with such wonderful resources, and I totally also agree with Pass It On Network. Jan and Maura actually have been presenters prior, and I know Jan, I actually saw that she's on the call today. So great resources, and there are wonderful resources in Liz's book. I really do recommend it, and I mean all three of them, but this one, she's sort of edited, and it's just filled with resources, stories, statistics. I just think it's really excellent. Yeah.
And we share if people want to order the book, they can order it from Amazon. Aging, Work, and Retirement is available from Amazon, but if they go to Rowman and Littlefield's website, which is Rowman.com, ROWMAN, Rowman.com, if they use this promotional code, they can get a 30% discount. I have nothing to do with what the cost. I have nothing to do with setting the cost of the books, and the 30% discount makes it much more reasonable. Can I share that?
It does. No, it absolutely. Please share that. And I must say, I had gotten mine through Amazon. I somehow forgot about the discount code, and go through the code because it is
I'll just
expensive,
mention it,
and it's well worth it.
Rowman.com, ROWMAN, Rowman.com. The promo code for ordering the book is RLFANDF 30. So that's RLF as in Fideler, ANDF as in Fideler 30. That's the promo code. And then you can also get it from Amazon. And I'm happy to say that another book is coming from Rowman and Littlefield in July of 2021, and this will be the Rowman and Littlefield Handbook on Aging and Work, and I serve as the editor of that handbook. So that's in production right now, and I'm very excited that it's coming out in July. And this handbook will be another great resource for people across many different fields, not just sociology and gerontology, but psychology and business management. So it's a social work and so on. This This whole topic of older workers, extended work life, and what's happening with retirement cuts across all those different fields.
It definitely does. And maybe after that one comes out, if you'd be willing, maybe we can have you back either later in this year or early next year, to come and continue the conversation about aging in the workforce, because it is such a crucial issue for everybody.
Well, thank you for that invitation. I'd love to do that. The handbook cuts across not just different fields, but many different topics. So one authors and some of the people who contributed chapters are very senior scholars, and sometimes they're working in partnership with early career researchers, and they're writing about a whole array of topics that fit under the topic of aging and work. I mean, I was honored to be asked to be the editor of this handbook, and I got to choose all the topics and invite all the contributing authors. So that was a really wonderful experience, and I'm eager to see the handbook when it comes out in July.
Any final comment that you want to make, Liz? Sort of a final takeaway?
Well, I would just say that with these trends accelerating, even with the pandemic as a rather big hiccup in the middle of everything, it's sort of like there's more to come. I think this is a fascinating area to be studying and to be talking about. I thank you for the opportunity to share it with a wider audience, because I think it's affecting more and more people with all the boomers out there, and a lot of people who aren't boomers but are looking ahead to, they're in the pre-retirement stage and they're looking ahead to retirement. There are a lot of people now saying, well, I'll never retire. I'll never be able to afford to retire. What is that? Right. So as this it's like a story that's unfolding, and I find it an important story, and I'm glad you share my thoughts on that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to be with us. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everybody, for being here and staying with us a little bit longer. And thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.